Three men, three different Mexicos, 1 year. The first man is named Castor Segundo Andrade. He is a corn farmer in the state of Morelos, in central Mexico, just south of Mexico City. In 1908, he is 53 years old. He has been farming the same land his family has farmed for 3 generations, land that was communal property of his village under arrangements that go back centuries to the period before the Spanish conquest. In 1908, he is watching that land disappear. The sugar haciendas, the great plantation estates, are expanding. They need land. The legal machinery of the Diaz government, operating through the land survey companies that were authorized in the 1880s to map and sell supposedly unclaimed land, has been providing it to them. Land that villages like Andrade's have used communally for generations is being declared unclaimed, surveyed, and sold to hacienda owners who plant sugar cane and pay wages to former farmers who now have no choice but to work for them. Andrade has been to the courts. He has been to the local government. He has been to Mexico City. Nobody is interested. The hacienda owner has money and lawyers and connections to the governor. Andrade has 3 generations of actual use and a Spanish colonial grant that the land survey company's survey has simply ignored. The second man is named William Howard Taft. He is the President of the United States. In 1908, he is 50 years old, and he has just won the presidential election that will make him the 27th President of the United States the following March. He is a Republican, a lawyer, a careful and methodical man who believes in the rule of law and in the management of the United States' expanding global interests through legal and institutional mechanisms rather than raw force. He is deeply interested in Mexico, which shares a 2,000-mile border with the United States, which is the destination of more American foreign investment than any other country in the world, and which is governed by a man named Porfirio Diaz, whom American investors regard as the most reliable guarantor of their interests in the Western Hemisphere. The third man is named Henry Clay Pierce. He is the majority owner of the Waters Pierce Oil Company, the dominant distributor of Standard Oil products in Mexico, and he controls, through a complex network of holding companies, preferential contracts, and political relationships, a substantial portion of Mexico's oil distribution business. In 1908, he is 57 years old, fabulously wealthy, connected to the highest levels of American political and financial life, and deeply concerned about a challenge to his commercial position in Mexico. The challenge is coming from a man named Lord Cowdray, Wheatman Pearson, the British oil baron, who has recently discovered enormous oil fields in Veracruz and Tamaulipas, and is building a pipeline and a distribution network that threatens to compete with Pierce's American-controlled monopoly. Pierce is lobbying in Washington. He is lobbying in Mexico City. He wants Diaz to favor American oil interests over British ones. He is not getting what he wants. This will matter. These 3 men, a Morelos corn farmer, an American president-elect, and an American oil magnate, are the real protagonists of the Mexican Revolution's origin story. They do not appear in the same room. They are not aware of each other's existence, at least not in any direct sense. But the forces they represent, the land dispossession of the Mexican peasantry, the strategic interests of the United States government in Mexican stability and American investment, and the commercial interests of American capital in Mexican resources, are the 3 forces whose collision produced the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And only one of them, the land dispossession, appears with any prominence in the standard histories of what happened. The standard history of the Mexican Revolution tells you about Francisco Madero, the wealthy landowner from Coahuila, who challenged Diaz in the 1910 election, and whose imprisonment and escape to Texas and issuance of the Plan de San Luis Potosí launched the armed phase of the revolution. It tells you about Emiliano Zapata, the horse trainer from Morelos, who became the most famous agrarian revolutionary in Mexican history, and whose demand for land restitution, tierra y libertad, land and liberty, became the most famous slogan of the revolution and one of the most famous political slogans of the 20th century. It tells you about Pancho Villa, the bandit turned revolutionary in the north, who turned the División del Norte into one of the most effective military forces in the hemisphere. It tells you about the decade of violence that followed Diaz's fall, the constitutionalist struggle, Zapata's assassination, Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico, the eventual consolidation of the PRI and the political system that would govern Mexico for the next 70 years. All of this is true and important. None of it adequately explains why the Mexican Revolution happened in 1910 and not in 1895 or 1905 or 1920. To explain the timing, to explain why a regime that had survived for 3 decades suddenly collapsed, you need the 3 forces that the standard history underemphasizes. The structural transformation of Mexican property relations under the Diaz government, which had been accumulating rural grievance for 30 years, but had reached a specific inflection point by 1908 to 1910. The specific dynamics of American strategic interest in Mexico, which were shifting in ways that reduced American commitment to propping up the Diaz regime precisely when that prop was most needed. And the specific dynamics of Anglo-American commercial competition in Mexican oil, which had turned Washington against Diaz at a moment of political crisis. Together, these 3 forces explain not just why the revolution happened, but why it happened when it did, and why the United States, which had been the most reliable external prop of the Diaz regime for 30 years, chose not to prevent its collapse. Begin with the land. Porfirio Diaz came to power in 1876 after defeating the sitting president Lerdo de Tejada in a military coup. He governed Mexico, with one interruption from 1880 to 1884, when he stepped down to satisfy constitutional term limits before resuming power until 1911. The 35 years of the Porfiriato, as his rule is known, produced in Mexico exactly what Diaz and his científicos, the technocratic advisors who managed his economic policy, intended it to produce. It produced economic growth. Mexico built railroads, more than 15,000 miles of them by 1910, compared to almost none in 1876. It attracted foreign investment on a massive scale. American, British, French, German capital poured into mining, oil, agriculture, and manufacturing. It stabilized public finances, which had been chronically disordered by the civil wars and foreign interventions of the preceding century. It created the infrastructure of a modern state in a country that had been, for most of the preceding century, a battlefield. What this growth required, and what the Diaz government systematically provided, was the concentration of land in the hands of the investors and the large landowners, the hacendados, who could use it productively for commercial agriculture, mining, and ranching. The communal land of indigenous villages, the ejido system that had its roots in both pre-Columbian indigenous practices and the colonial Spanish legal system, was an obstacle to this concentration. The liberal land reform legislation of the 1850s and 1860s, the Ley Lerdo, had already attacked the legal basis of communal landholding. The Diaz government extended and accelerated this attack through the land survey companies, private companies authorized to survey unoccupied land and receive 1/3 of what they surveyed as payment, and through the jefes políticos, the local political bosses who served as the Diaz government's enforcers at the local level, and who had enormous power to facilitate or obstruct the legal processes through which communal land was transferred to private ownership. The numbers tell the story with precision. In 1876, when Diaz came to power, approximately 1/3 of Mexico's agricultural land was communal village land. By 1910, estimates suggest that less than 2% of Mexico's population owned approximately 95% of its agricultural land, and that the communal village land that had supported the rural poor for centuries had been largely absorbed into the hacienda system. This was not a slow or gradual process that the affected communities failed to notice. It was a rapid and legally visible process that produced an enormous volume of litigation, petition, protest, and eventually violence at the local level throughout the Porfiriato. What changed by 1908 to 1910 was not the process. It had been ongoing for 30 years. But the exhaustion of the legal and political avenues through which communities had been attempting to resist it. By 1910, the communities that had been fighting through courts and petitions for decades had concluded with considerable justification that those avenues were closed. Morelos, Castor Segundo Andrade's state, was the extreme case. Sugar cultivation was highly profitable and highly land-intensive, and the sugar haciendas of Morelos had expanded with particular aggressiveness. By 1910, the 24 major sugar plantations of Morelos controlled approximately 1/3 of the state's total land area. The 33 free villages of Morelos, which had been surrounded by hacienda land, had lost the access to communal grazing, wood cutting, and marginal cultivation that had supplemented their agricultural income. The hacienda system needed labor as well as land, and it got labor partly by ensuring that the dispossessed villages had no alternative. The combination of land loss and wage dependency had turned the communities of Morelos into a powder keg by 1908. Emiliano Zapata, who became their leader, did not create the revolutionary movement of Morelos. He articulated and organized a grievance that the land policies of the Porfiriato had been manufacturing for 30 years. The northern case was different in its specific features but shared the essential structure. In the states of Chihuahua and Sonora, the land dispossession had operated through different mechanisms. The survey of communal land belonging to Yaqui and other indigenous communities, the concentration of former military colonies into large cattle ranches controlled by politically connected families, the displacement of smallholders by American and Mexican corporate ranching interests. Pancho Villa's constituency, the rancheros and sharecroppers and former soldiers of Chihuahua, had their own accumulated grievances against the land concentration of the Porfiriato, grievances that were structurally similar to those of Morelos, even though the specific history was entirely different. Now consider the United States. American investment in Mexico under Diaz reached approximately $1 billion by 1910, more than the total American investment in any other country in the world, and more than the total investment of all Mexican nationals in their own country. American capital owned the majority of Mexico's mining industry. American capital owned significant portions of Mexico's railroad system. American capital was heavily invested in Mexican land, in cattle ranches in the north, in henequen plantations in Yucatan, in rubber plantations in Chiapas. The economic relationship between the United States and Mexico, under Diaz, was the most consequential bilateral economic relationship in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States government had an enormous institutional interest in the stability of the regime that had created the conditions for that investment. This interest was the foundation of what can only be described as an American-Diaz political alliance. Diaz understood that American support was essential to his regime's survival, and he went to considerable lengths to ensure it. He welcomed American investors with favorable concessions. He maintained the legal and institutional conditions, property rights, contract enforcement, suppression of labor organization, that American investors required. He maintained public order with sufficient effectiveness that American investors felt their property was secure. And he cultivated personal relationships with American presidents and secretaries of state that gave him a degree of diplomatic protection that no Mexican leader had previously enjoyed. The alliance began to fray in the specific period between 1906 and 1910, and the fraying was caused by several specific developments that changed the American calculation about the value of supporting Diaz. The first development was labor. The growth of mining and industrial production in Mexico had produced a Mexican working class, and the working class was beginning to organize. The strikes at Cananea, a copper mining town in Sonora owned by an American company, the Consolidated Copper Company, run by William Cornell Green, in June 1906, produced a confrontation that revealed contradictions in the American position. American Rangers crossed into Mexico to help suppress the strike, which American investors wanted. But the suppression of strikes by foreign forces on Mexican soil was a sovereignty issue that created political difficulties for both the Diaz government and the American relationship with Mexico. The specific terms of American capital's operation in Mexico, including the exclusion of Mexican workers from skilled and supervisory positions in American-owned mines, and the dramatic wage differential between American and Mexican workers doing the same jobs, were creating labor tensions that threatened the stability that American investment required. The second development was the Rio Blanco textile strike of January 1907, in which Mexican federal troops opened fire on striking workers, killing an estimated 200 people. The massacre was the kind of event that, in the specific political climate of the United States in 1907, which had its own labor conflicts and its own debates about the rights of workers, generated negative attention in American newspapers and among American politicians who were otherwise supportive of the Diaz regime. The implicit American argument for supporting Diaz, that his regime produced stability and order that protected investment, was harder to make when the order it produced required the massacre of textile workers. The third development was oil, and this is the dimension that the standard histories of the Mexican Revolution most consistently underemphasize, because it requires taking seriously the idea that American foreign policy toward Mexico was shaped by specific commercial interests rather than by the general interest in stability that American government officials always articulated. The discovery of oil in Mexico in commercially significant quantities was one of the most consequential economic developments in the Western Hemisphere in the early 20th century. By 1910, Mexico was producing approximately 12 million barrels of oil per year, and production was growing rapidly. By 1921, Mexico would be the world's second largest oil producer, accounting for approximately a quarter of global production. The oil was being developed primarily by two groups of interests: American companies, particularly through the Waters Pierce distribution network, and through the exploration activities of Standard Oil affiliates, and British interests, primarily through the El Aguila Company controlled by Lord Cowdray, Wheatman Pearson, who had built his fortune in Mexico through major engineering contracts, and who had diversified into oil as the scale of Mexican petroleum became clear. The competition between American and British oil interests in Mexico was conducted at every level: in the drilling of wells, in the construction of pipelines, in the negotiation of concessions with the Mexican government, and in the lobbying of the respective governments for diplomatic support. And it was conducted in a specific political context. Diaz, who had generally favored American investment throughout the Porfiriato, was shifting his position by 1907 and 1908, giving increasingly favorable terms to British oil interests as a way of reducing Mexico's dependence on American capital and maintaining some degree of leverage against a partner whose relative power made genuine negotiation difficult. The shift toward British oil interests was a rational move by Diaz from a Mexican national interest perspective. He was using Cowdray's British capital to create competition for American capital and to improve his own negotiating position. But from the perspective of American oil interests, and particularly from the perspective of Henry Clay Pierce, who saw his carefully built commercial position in Mexico being challenged by a British competitor with better political connections to the current Mexican government, the shift was an act of betrayal. Pierce was spending money lobbying in Washington. He was in contact with American political figures, including members of the Taft administration, arguing that American oil interests in Mexico were being discriminated against in favor of British interests, and that this was a matter of American national concern. The specific channel through which the Pierce oil interests influenced American policy toward Mexico is documented in the historical record, though the documentation is incomplete and the causal relationships are contested. What is clear is that by 1909 and 1910, the American government's attitude toward Diaz had cooled significantly from the warm embrace of the 1880s and 1890s. The specific reason, whether it was the labor massacres, the shift toward British oil interests, the growing instability that Diaz's aging grip on power was producing, or some combination, is harder to pin down. But the consequence was that when Diaz faced a genuine political challenge in 1910, he did not receive the American diplomatic support that had been available to him in previous crises. Francisco Madero's challenge to Diaz in the 1910 election was, in its origins, a respectable liberal democratic movement. Madero was a wealthy landowner from Coahuila, educated in the United States and France, who believed in democracy, free elections, and the rule of law. He was not a revolutionary in the social sense. He did not initially challenge the land concentration of the Porfiriato or the economic arrangements that had produced it. What he challenged was the political monopoly of Diaz, the absence of genuine elections, and the continuismo, the indefinite continuation of the same ruler, that had made the Porfiriato simultaneously stable and stagnant. His 1910 presidential campaign attracted genuine popular support, particularly among the urban middle class and among the small landowners and professionals of the North, who had done reasonably well economically under Diaz, but who resented political exclusion. Diaz responded in the way he had always responded to political challenge. He had Madero arrested in June 1910, just before the election, and then staged an election in which he received 99% of the vote. This was not unusual by Porfiriato standards. What was unusual was what happened next. Madero escaped from prison in San Luis Potosí in October 1910 and crossed into Texas. From San Antonio, he issued the Plan de San Luis Potosí, a political manifesto that declared the recent election null and void, called for Diaz's resignation, and called on the Mexican people to rise in arms on November 20th, 1910. The date passed with relatively little armed activity. The revolution that the plan called for did not begin on schedule, but it began. In Chihuahua, Pascual Orozco and Pancho Villa began raising armed forces. In Morelos, Emiliano Zapata began organizing the communities whose land grievances had been accumulating for 30 years. In Sonora, groups of Yaqui warriors and displaced rancheros began taking up arms. The armed phase of the Mexican Revolution that the Plan de San Luis Potosí called for was not a unified national uprising responding to a single political call. It was an aggregation of local revolts, each with its own specific grievances and its own specific leadership, that happened simultaneously because the underlying conditions, land dispossession, political exclusion, economic resentment, were simultaneously ripe across multiple regions of Mexico. The Taft administration's response to the Mexican crisis was the critical external variable. Throughout the armed phase of the revolution, from November 1910 through the Battle of Ciudad Juárez in May 1911, which was the battle that broke Diaz's military capacity and forced his resignation, the Taft administration maintained a posture of official neutrality. It concentrated troops on the Mexican border in a way that Diaz interpreted as threatening, and that reduced his confidence that American military intervention would prevent his overthrow if military intervention proved necessary. It permitted the export of arms from Texas to Madero's forces, despite requests from the Diaz government to prevent it. It allowed Madero to operate from American territory in ways that a genuinely neutral government could have restricted. The neutrality was not genuine neutrality, it was a choice. And the choice reflected the specific calculus of American interests in 1910 and 1911, a calculus that had shifted significantly from the calculus that had sustained the American-Diaz alliance for 3 decades. The American government had concluded, by early 1911, that Diaz was finished, that the regime was too weak and too discredited to survive, and that the best American interest was served not by attempting to prop up a collapsing regime, but by establishing a good relationship with whatever government replaced it. The oil interests that wanted Diaz, replaced by a government more favorable to American capital, were pushing in the same direction. The progressive politicians who were embarrassed by American association with a government that massacred striking workers were pushing in the same direction. And the basic assessment of the State Department that a regime that had lost the confidence of the military, the urban middle class, and significant portions of the rural population was not worth the political and military cost of sustaining was pushing in the same direction. Porfirio Diaz resigned on May 25, 1911. He sailed for Europe on May 31st from Veracruz. He would never return to Mexico. He died in Paris in 1915 at the age of 84, and his body was not returned to Mexico for burial until 1999. What followed Diaz's departure was a decade of violence more intense and more costly than anything the revolution had experienced in its first phase. Madero's moderate democratic government proved unable to satisfy either the conservative forces, the army, the church, the old land-owning elite, who wanted the minimal disruption that Diaz's resignation had already caused, or the radical forces, Zapata in the south, Villa in the north, who wanted the genuine social revolution that Madero's Plan de San Luis Potosí had not promised, and that Madero's government was not delivering. Madero was overthrown in February 1913 in a coup organized by General Victoriano Huerta, with the knowledge and the at least tacit support of the American ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, whose hostility to Madero had been explicit and whose role in the events of the Decena Tragica, the 10 Tragic Days, remains one of the most disputed and most damning episodes in the history of American intervention in Mexican affairs. Madero was arrested after the coup. He was shot dead on February 22, 1913, officially while attempting to escape from prison. Nobody believed the official account. His murder by the Huerta regime converted what had been a regional rebellion in the north into a national constitutional movement committed to his vindication. The constitutionalists, under Venustiano Carranza in the northeast, Álvaro Obregón in Sonora, and Pancho Villa in Chihuahua, launched the military campaign that within 18 months had destroyed the Huerta regime and forced Huerta himself into exile. But the destruction of Huerta did not end the revolution. It revealed that the revolution was not a single movement with a single goal, but a coalition of incompatible forces that had agreed on what they were against: the Diaz regime, the Huerta usurpation, without agreeing on what they were for. Zapata wanted land. Villa wanted something more inchoate: justice, dignity, the elimination of the landed oligarchy. But his specific demands were never as precisely articulated as Zapata's. Carranza wanted a constitutional government that preserved the existing social structure while reforming the political system. Obregón, the most politically sophisticated of the revolutionary commanders, understood that the social dimensions of the revolution could not be ignored, and that a settlement that satisfied only the political dimension would not hold. The Constitution of 1917, the document that emerged from the Constituent Assembly at Querétaro, and that is still the basic law of Mexico, was the Obregón-Carranza attempt to incorporate the social demands of the revolution into a constitutional framework. Its Article 27, which established the principle that land and water and natural resources belonged ultimately to the nation, and that private property rights in them were subject to public use limitations, addressed the land question in principle, while leaving its implementation deliberately ambiguous. Its Article 123, which established labor rights, including the 8-hour day, the right to organize, and minimum wages, addressed the labor question that the Cananilla and Rio Blanco strikes had dramatized. But the Constitution's promises were not immediately implemented, and the men who had written them, Carranza above all, showed little enthusiasm for implementation that would challenge their own class interests. Zapata was assassinated in April 1919, lured to a meeting by a supposed defector, and shot by forces loyal to Carranza. Villa survived until 1923, when he was ambushed and killed outside the town of Parral. Both deaths were ordered by former revolutionary commanders, who had concluded that the agrarian radicals were an obstacle to the consolidation of a stable post-revolutionary order. The murders were not the end of the agrarian question. That question would continue to shape Mexican politics for decades, through the land reforms of the Lázaro Cárdenas presidency in the 1930s, and through the Chiapas uprising of the Zapatistas in 1994, which took its name and its symbolic reference point from the man who had been assassinated 75 years earlier. But they marked the moment when the radical, agrarian strand of the revolution was subordinated to the political and economic consolidation of the post-revolutionary state. What they got wrong about the Mexican Revolution is multiple and layered. They got wrong the idea that it was primarily a political revolution, a movement to replace Diaz's dictatorship with democratic government. The political dimension was real and important, but the social and economic dimensions, the land question above all, were equally real and far more explosive. The millions of rural Mexicans who fought and died in the revolution were not fighting for elections. They were fighting for land. They were fighting against the specific dispossession that the Porfiriato had inflicted on them over 30 years. Madero gave them a political vehicle, but the fuel was the agrarian grievance that men like Castor Segundo Andrade embodied. They got wrong the idea that the United States played no role in the revolution's outcome. The American strategic and commercial interest in Mexico shaped the environment in which the revolution occurred and succeeded. The decision of the Taft administration not to intervene to save Diaz was as consequential as any military decision made by any revolutionary commander. The American oil interests that wanted a Mexican government more favorable to American capital than Diaz had become were a specific and documented influence on American policy. The specific neutrality that allowed Madero to operate from Texas and that allowed arms to flow south across the border was not an accident. It was a choice. They got wrong the relationship between the revolution and what followed it. The PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party that governed Mexico from 1929 to 2000, presented itself as the heir and the fulfillment of the Mexican Revolution. But the PRY's Mexico was not the Mexico that Zapata or Villa or the millions of rural poor who fought in the revolution had imagined. It was a Mexico in which a new political elite had used the language of the revolution to consolidate a political system that reproduced many of the features of the Porfiriato: political monopoly, subordination of rural populations to urban political interests, a close relationship with foreign capital operating in Mexico under a revolutionary vocabulary that made those features harder to criticize and easier to accept. The Mexican Revolution is one of the great events of the 20th century. It produced the first genuinely social constitution of the modern era, a document that influenced constitutional drafting from Weimar Germany to Republican Spain to post-colonial Africa. It produced a school of muralist painting: Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, David Alfaro Siqueiros. That is one of the most significant artistic movements of the century. It produced a political system that, whatever its failures, maintained a degree of national sovereignty in relation to American power that most of Latin America could not achieve. And it produced, in the specific figure of Emiliano Zapata, a political symbol of agrarian justice and indigenous resistance that has outlasted every institution and every government of the century since his death. But it did not produce the Mexico that the majority of those who fought in it were fighting for. The land that men like Castor Segundo Andrade lost under Diaz was not fully restored. The social transformation that Zapata's Plan de Ayala demanded was not implemented in any comprehensive way until Cardenas in the 1930s, and even then imperfectly and incompletely. The political monopoly of the Porfiriato was replaced by the political monopoly of the PRI, which proved just as durable and ultimately required its own revolution, the peaceful electoral revolution of 2000, to end. What the Mexican Revolution produced was not the transformation of Mexico from an oligarchic society to a democratic and egalitarian one. It produced the transformation of Mexico from one oligarchic system to another, with a revolutionary vocabulary and a genuine set of social reforms that made the new system significantly better than the old one for significant portions of the population, while leaving the fundamental structures of land, power, and economic hierarchy recognizable from the Porfiriato through the end of the 20th century. Castor Segundo Andrade, the corn farmer from Morelos, probably died before the revolution ended. Most of the people who fought in it did. The land his family had farmed for 3 generations was partly restored in the agrarian reforms of the revolutionary period, and partly incorporated into Ejido land that was protected under Article 27. Whether he would have considered the outcome worth the cost, the 1 to 2 million dead, the enormous physical and economic destruction, the decade of chaos, is impossible to know. The revolution he helped make produced something real. It did not produce what he was fighting for. If this story changed the way you think about revolutions, about the gap between what they promise and what they deliver, about the external forces that shape their outcomes, and about whose interests they ultimately serve, subscribe. Every week we go deep on the decisions, the interests, and the compromises that shaped the great upheavals of the modern world. Drop a comment below on whether you think the Mexican Revolution achieved its goals. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.